Okay. Oops, I've got a message here that that I'm not being heard. Can people hear me? Can you indicate now whether terribly sorry. Okay. I welcome everybody and welcome to the webinar. We're covering three things today which are critically important. We're going to look at influencing capabilities, and in particular I'm hoping you had a chance to complete your influencing capabilities framework. So I hope that went well for you, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what influence actually is. I'm going to talk about the 4 influencing strategies, and there are 4, and of those 4 there are a number of capabilities as well. And I'm going to finish up the session talking about some practical tools that you can use to apply. So that's how we work, and if you've got questions or comments, just go to the question box and type in your statement or comment, and I will address it as we go because I'm watching it all the time, which makes it very easy for all of us. So more than happy to deal with things as they come up. All right, so I hope you've all had a chance to practice your feedback, and of course these sessions are all about practicing. I give you homework at the end of the 6 sessions, and the whole idea is to go away and do things differently, and that becomes critically important. So I'm hoping that you've had a chance to do that and you've got some good feedback from your feedback. So keep that up. The whole purpose of this is to continue doing that while you add another layer, which of course in this case will be how to influence people to get things done, which is of course your role as a leader. All right, so now that we know what we're covering, let's get stuck into it. So my first question to you is, you'll notice that very soon, there you are on your screen, you'll notice that there are 4 people. There it comes again. There are 4 leaders. And my question to you is this: what do they all have in common? Now, it's not a trick question, but have a look at them. You probably recognise all of them. You certainly would, I have no doubt, recognise their face. You may well know who they all are, and I'll explain who they all are in a minute, just in case you're not sure. But my question to you is, what do they all have in common? And I think the question, what they all have in common is they have all been, well, first of all, there are 3 of them that are dead, and there's 1 that's alive. So that's not something they all have in common. But one thing they all have in common is that they're all highly influential. They have, in their own way, influenced our world in a way. Now, when you look at these characters, they will no doubt create a sense of emotion. What I mean by that is that some of you will either loathe or like the people that I have on the screen. So in other words, people have all got an opinion about these 4 leaders, and that's not the reason that I'm going to refer to them as we go through this broadcast today. I'm really using them to help you to understand what the influencing style is of each of these 4 leaders, because each of them represent one of the 4 strategies that I'm going to be running through here this afternoon with you. So up in the top, in the right hand, in the left hand, up at the top on the left, we have Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States of America and climate change activist. We have Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain for a period of 10 years. We have Dr. Martin Luther King, who was the civil rights activist prominent in the 1960s, who was assassinated in 1968. And we have Mother Teresa, who had recently been admitted to sainthood by the Catholic Church for her work in the streets of Calcutta, looking after the sick and the poor. So each of those people in their own way has made an incredible impact on our society. So as I've said, as I go through these, I'm not proponent, I'm not promoting them, their ideology or anything like that. I'm simply using them as a vehicle for you to understand the 4 influencing strategies that come out of your profile. All right, so that's important, and in fact, you will find that you can find out a lot more if you go and Google these, and you can actually see these people in action. You will see precisely what I mean about their capacity to influence. All right, so I'm just raising that with you so that you can see how they might work in terms of how they influence or have influenced. Now, what I want to say here up front is let's get a definition of influence. Here it is, it's on your screen, gone away, here it is again. Now let's understand what we mean by influence. This is my definition of influence, and I think it's very important that we get what I mean by influence. And in my book, The New Influencing Toolkit, this is the definition that I use to explain what influence is. And by the way, one of the reasons that I wrote that book is that I found that there was too much academic stuff out there that wasn't of any practical value to people like you and me. And then at the other end of the continuum, I found that there was too much salesy type stuff that wasn't relevant to the day-to-day business of leading people. So I kind of felt that there was a market or a gap in the marketplace for a book that was very practical for leaders around the whole notion of being able to influence people. So that's my rationale for putting this together. And I argue that influence is actually the power to make other people agree with your opinions or to get them to do what you want willingly and ethically. And the key words in there is power. Yes, it has to do with power, but we're all merchants of power. Every day we're trying to influence all sorts of people about all sorts of things, whether it's our children, our teenage children, whether it's our partners, whether it's our supervisor, whether it's our team members, whether it's another stakeholder inside local government or outside local government in the community. We're all in the business of influence. And that's important that we get that first up. And you'll notice that the 2 other key words there are willingly. In other words, we want people to do things because they want to do it, not because you've manipulated them into doing it, but that they can see the value and the benefit of doing what you want them to do. And secondly, that it's done in such a way as it's done in a transparent, open way, so that there's no cunningness or underhandedness at all in terms of the way we attempt to manipulate people or use trickery. So those things are not part of what I'm on about in this particular broadcast. And so let's get that clear and out of the way before we go any further. So guys, if you've got any questions, please by all means type them into the question box and I will respond to them as soon as I see them on the screen. All right, now this slide is really just saying, as it'll come up in a minute, the slide here that is about to come up is really saying this, and it's I think it's an important point I've sort of raised with you, and that is that we, that's you and me, we are actually in the business of influence. Now, as I said before, if you think about what you do every single day, in every single way, with all sorts of people that you interact with, it is all about influence. And sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not, but all of us are attempting to influence people. Whether we're trying to influence the community to consider a certain course of action, or whether it might be to consider our stakeholders, whether it might be to consider our manager, get our manager to consider our proposal, whether it is to consider our colleagues in a team meeting, all of these things are influencing opportunities. And I think it's very important that all of us learn to get extremely good at this particular skill, and I think I'd call it a skill. Okay, we've got a question here. Tim, you keep dropping out completely. Okay, sorry, that's not a question. Okay, I'm sorry if I drop out. There's not much I can do. I'm certainly got a cable connected to the computer. I've turned off my firewalls. We'll just have to see if this comes good. So I apologise about that. Nothing I can do at this end. All right. If we move on, there are three important variables in any influencing circumstance. And I want you to have a think about this from your own point of view. The first variable is your preferred style or approach. Now, how do you know what your preferred style or approach is? Well, you know because if you completed the influencing capabilities profile, you would be aware of your particular approach and style. Now, what happens is that we will tend to use that approach or style too frequently, and the reason for that is because we feel comfortable using it, and we've all had cases where we have used an approach or style and it hasn't been effective. And the reason perhaps that it hasn't been effective is that perhaps you're using the wrong approach. In other words, the other person, which is the second variable, doesn't relate so much to that influencing approach. In other words, they'd prefer to be influenced using another particular way. So the second variable is, how does the other person like to be influenced? That's got a critical impact on how effective we're going to be. And the third important point in all of this is that it's the context. It is the context which we are interested in, and certain circumstances will require different forms of influence. So that becomes critically important as well. So, you know, for example, if you're working in a situation where you've got to get a quick result, then you may not afford the opportunity to collaborate. You may well have to make a unilateral decision and frankly then talk about it later on. So there are circumstances where it is you know, impossible for you to consult people and so forth. So when you consider those three things together, this will determine your effectiveness in that particular circumstance. So your style, the style or the preferred style of the people that you're attempting to influence, and the situation that you're in. So let's have a look at that in a bit further detail. Now, what you're seeing on your screen at the moment, or yep, there it is. It's gone again. There it is. So what you're seeing on your screen is my influencing capabilities framework, which is a pretty simple framework, and the profile is based on the framework. So if you've completed your profile, which I know many of you have, you will be able to have a look at your scores on your framework. And if you look at your scores on your framework, it'll tell you something about, you know, what you like, how you like to influence. Let's have a look. The first thing that you'll notice is up the top, you'll notice it's got a push style and a pull style. So let me define what I mean by a push style and a pull style, and then have a look at your scores. So if you add up your investigation and your motivation scores, you add them up, you'll get a total score that you can put up the top there with a box which says push style, and you can write it in there. And equally, if you add up your calculation and collaboration scores, there'll be a little box next to the pull style up in the final one, and you can actually see which is higher, one or the other. Okay, so which is higher, push or pull? Here's a little graph or chart that might actually help you understand the difference between the two. So you'll notice up there in the left-hand corner, you've got a number of factors which are around the push style. People who enjoy the style of pushing are people who are often, driving at a point of view, they're making a proposal, they're often in situations where they like to give information, and they'll tend to block out contrary information. In other words, they'll rebut other arguments that are counter to their particular argument, and they'll take their and they'll take their idea to the person rather than the person come to them with the idea. All right, just got a message here. I don't know what you mean by about scores. Well, if you've completed your influencing capabilities profile, you would have had to have scored. In the last page there is this model, and it asks you to put your scores on the model. So that's basically what I'm referring to. Yes, the profile was emailed to you, and there was a link in the last email that I sent you, so you would have that on the link. Okay, now you'll notice that over on the left-hand side you've got logic and emotional approaches. So you've got two different forms or different approaches. Now, let me explain what they mean to you and give you a little bit of an idea as to how they might work. So people who like to influence using logic will, as you could imagine, like to use facts. They like to use evidence. They usually are quite structured and rational in their approach and so forth. Now, if you, on your influencing capabilities profile on the last page, if you add up your calculation score, that's your total score in the middle, and you add up your investigation score, that's the total score in the middle, you add those two scores up, you'll notice there's a little box next to the logical approach on the left-hand, actually it'll be on your right-hand side actually. You put it in the box there and you'll have a score for logic. All right, and then if you do the same for motivation and collaboration, you add up your two scores, total scores, you'll have a score there for your emotional approach. Okay? Now, whichever's the highest will tell you something about whether you like to influence using logic or whether you like to use emotion. So people who like to use emotion when they're influencing will have a tendency people who like to use emotion will have a tendency to use feelings. They will tend to talk about people's perceptions. They'll talk about values more than fact. They will have a tendency to be quite flexible in their approach, and they'll be very conscious of building and maintaining morale. So neither one is better than the other, and I think this is very, very important that, your scores are just a profile. It doesn't tell you whether you've got a better profile than someone else. It's just how you view the world, and in particular how you like to influence other people. So that is the mechanics of it, and if you look down, you will see that there are 4 particular strategies. Investigation, and I'm using a little icon to help you with each of these so that it sort of helps. So we've got Sherlock Holmes there. So Sherlock Holmes obviously liked to investigate things and put together a watertight case, and that's essentially what investigators do by nature as an investigator. You've got calculation, which essentially is about talking up the pros and talking up the cons. So the pros are things that are positive about the particular approach that you want to use, and the cons or the disadvantages are the things around things that we need to acknowledge before You know, if we don't do this, here are all the disadvantages, in other words. And look, the best example I can give you is that I walked past a Harvey Norman store a couple of months ago, and there was a sign outside the door that said 40% off all laptops, which is going to attract a lot of attention, isn't it? So I decided to go into the store, as you do. And when I got into the store, there was another message up there on the wall that said, "Must purchase by the close of business today to get your 40% discount." So this was a classic calculation strategy. So they're talking about talking up the positives, and they're also indicating to you that there was a deadline in terms of when you could actually purchase these laptops. So people in retail situations, obviously distinct from local government, can use calculation very effectively to get our attention. Then the two at the bottom, which the difference is that they're both emotional forms of influence. Motivation is an emotional approach based on the push style, which is about explaining to people what the strategic direction of counsel is and using that strategic direction to be able to influence people around them as to how they might operate. And the other one, of course, is the collaboration, which is the approach where people will work together, and because people have been consulted and working together, they feel part of something. So they feel they have a stake or an ownership in the decision. So people who have a high score in that area often see the great value of working with and through other people in order to influence people. So that gives you an overview. So if you've got any questions, guys, just type them in. I'm more than happy to take questions or comments. So if you've got comments that you'd like to make as we go through each of these particular approaches. So while you might be thinking about that, let me move on to the next slide, if I may. And it's about coming up now. It's almost there. There we go. Now, of course, you did the paper, and those of you that did the prerequisite for this, you would have done the paper version. And I just point out to you that if you would like to, there's an electronic version that I'm more than happy to share a link with you. There is a small fee associated with it, but it's not exorbitant, and you might like to do the electronic version. And the advantage of that is it produces a 14-page report which gives you what you're seeing in front of you, as amongst other things, some percentages around where you fall on each of the particular strategies, which can be quite insightful. And you've got a whole lot of other graphs and charts that might be helpful. So if you didn't get around to clicking on the link and doing your homework, you might like to talk to me about doing this particular diagnostic. Just send me an email and I'm happy to send you the link. But you can see there that, you know, if you look at this person, and this is a real person, but obviously their name, we've removed their name, you'll notice that up on the push style they have 63%, and if you look on their pull style they have 60%. So not a lot of difference, and what that essentially means is that this person is more than happy to fluctuate between a push and a pull style when they're influencing people. And that's not a bad thing, because it means that they can see the value and benefit of both and can probably comfortably maneuver between the two different styles. Over on the left-hand side, you'll notice that they scored 70 for logic and they scored 53 for emotional. So have a look at your scores on the paper version, which of course would be on the right-hand side. But in this case here, you can see that this person's got a clear bias towards logic over emotion. So they're more likely to use facts and figures and structure and evidence to try to influence other people when they need to. And in fact, that's what they like to do when they're being influenced as well. They like their people to do the same thing with them. So my comment to them would be perhaps to start to build up some of the areas in the emotional, some capabilities that might help them to become even more influential. All right, so that's the broad outlook, so you can have a look at your own scores there. Now, the other thing that's interesting there is that if you'll notice there are percentages around, there are 4 capabilities for each influencing strategy. So investigation, for example, has 4 capabilities which include gathering evidence, countering arguments, asserting ideas and generating ideas. So those 4 add up to the total, which is the investigation strategy. And the scores there indicate percentages. In your case, you would have a number that you had to rate out of +2, +1, 0, -1, and +2, -2, depending on how comfortable and you would use that approach. Incidentally, people have said to me in our local government forum here, have said, you know, it depends on the circumstances, absolutely. It does, and also we might not be giving a true and accurate reflection of what we're really like, absolutely. And my suggestion is that you might like to get someone that knows you really well inside your local government organisation to complete this survey for you. And that can be very interesting. And you can actually have a look and see whether they agree with your particular judgments about your influencing capabilities. So that's something that you might like to do if this interests you further, is to take it to the next level and actually consider that as an approach there that might help you validate your results. All right, keep the questions and comments coming through, guys, and I'll certainly deal with them as we get them. Okay, now, if I look at this profile, for example, this one that's in front of us, and say, well, where could this person make some improvements? What I'm actually looking for is the relative low scores. And if I cast my eyes down to offering concessions, I can see that this person scored themselves 33%. And of course, in your paper version, have a look at your comparative scores against other scores. So that would be an area that I'd probably put some work into. And another area that I'd probably consider to do some work is connecting emotionally. Down here in the motivation strategy, I've got 40%. So there's 2 I'd probably spend a bit of time doing some work on. In other words, I'd be looking for opportunities where I could practice exercising that capability. Now, I'm going to finish this broadcast with some very practical ways of doing that, and in fact for all 4 strategies. So you'll actually get to see some examples of that as we look through the different styles and approaches. All right, so let's move on. Now, what I want to do now is talk a little bit more about each of the particular strategies, and it's coming up on your screen about now. And what I'd like to do is to use these 4 famous people that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation and give you some sense of who they are and how they like to influence. And if you fall into this category, you might be able to relate to them. And if you don't, you might be able to understand better what this strategy entails. So investigators like, as I said, to marshal their facts and figures, and they'll tend to assertively advance their case using logic and structure. And Al Gore was a devastating, or probably still is, a devastating debater. Very, very good at being able to rebut other people's arguments and to put a strong argument forth for his particular approach. And it might actually pay for you to go in and have a look at his very famous video, Inconvenient Truth. And, you know, you just have to Google that and through YouTube. And you'll find a very good example of Al Gore, who's using lots of charts, lots of statistics, lots of graphics in a very structured way, very methodical and structured way. And it's highly effective. And of course, it's highly effective if you know you have a predisposition to be influenced by investigation strategies. So that's Al Gore, and let's have a little bit more of a look at this investigation approach. So what will be coming up in your screen very soon is that you will see up the top of the first bullet point, you'll see the different sorts of occupations which have a tendency to use investigation in order to be effective at their work. Now, obviously, anyone in the police service is going to, that's their job. They go and investigate a situation. They put a brief of evidence together, and therefore they will prosecute someone before a court of law. And if they're successful, of course, that individual is prosecuted. But their whole influencing strategy is based on a body of evidence that they collect. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. If you think about scientists and researchers, they also use this strategy very effectively when they are they put a hypothesis forward, they try and demonstrate or prove that hypothesis, and if they're successful in gathering and marshalling evidence from their research methodology, they can be highly influential in terms of changing people's thinking and approach to a particular topic. So there are a couple of examples of occupations. In local government, of course, there's a lot of things that you do which require a case of evidence that you need to investigate. And in order for the community to have confidence that you've considered, or for council for that matter, you've got to put together a proposal which basically has a has a respect for the facts. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But if you actually think about it, where this is very, very powerful is in workplace incidents such as issues around safety. So if you're in the outdoor workforce in a council and there is an investigation, or there's an accident at least, and there needs to be an investigation, normally the investigation is done in a very thorough and methodical way, and it's done in such a way that you are attempting to put a case for what actually happened, to understand and get to the root cause of the problem. And of course, being a leader, if someone's approached you about an allegation of bullying or harassment, you are obliged to investigate that. And what that means is that you've got to go and put some thorough investigation together in order to collect and marshal your resources in order to understand how that bullying, or whether there's any case to answer in terms of harassment and bullying. So that becomes really quite important as such. Moving to and of course, where it's not going to work for you is where you have large-scale change initiatives where people actually need to be on board. So they kind of just need to understand the general reason why there is being a retrenchment, or they need to understand why there's a new computer system that's been installed. All of these things require an explanation from the leader, and giving the facts and figures are secondary to that. Of course, people want to know about the facts at some point. They want to know that, but they actually want to know the broad thrust of why something is happening the way it is. So that's the investigation. Now let's move on to the next one. Calculators. So people who like to calculate are people who will tend to promote a proposal in terms of talking about its benefits and on the other hand, they will talk about the disadvantages of not accepting the proposal. And here's a little tip for you in local government. If, in fact, you have to address council, my strong feeling is that if you're putting together a proposal, in other words, you're trying to influence council about a certain course of action, I strongly recommend that in your briefing papers you have some pros and cons. So you almost put down 3 or 4 key benefits as to why this proposal is effective, and you put down 3 key disadvantages of not going down this road, and then councillors will often look at it, the elected representatives will look at it, and they'll see very quickly the pros and cons for a particular approach, and that becomes critically important as such. Margaret Thatcher is a good example of somebody who used this as a leader. People either love or hate Margaret Thatcher. There is no in between. People have very strong views, as I'm sure you do, and I'm not using her for any other reason than to show that she was very good at being very clear about what she was on about, and by the same token putting deterrence in the way for people who perhaps didn't like what she was proposing. So people basically, in a word or in a phrase, knew where they stood with her, and that became critically important. So if we consider Margaret Thatcher as an example of somebody who uses calculation, so those of you who had a high score in this area would have a tendency to be very process-driven, would be very regulatory, would know the laws and the bylaws inside out, and probably would quote those on a regular basis. People would know where they stood, and you would have a clarity around doing what is right based on the key performance indicators and the regulatory environment you're working in local government, which clearly has a regulatory framework attached to it. So let's look at a couple of the occupations that would use calculation as a strategy. This should be coming up on your screen very shortly. It's gone. It'll be coming up now. Oh, gone again. There it is. Gone. Salespeople. Salespeople, as I said before, are people who have a great tendency to talk up some product or service, and on the other hand, they'll talk down not going down this road, and it'll force people often to make a decision about what they need to do as a result of that advice. The financial advisors will say often they'll talk up the advantages of a proposal, and then they'll say that this is probably the best deal going and it probably won't ever be repeated. So it's really important that you consider that. So that's how they tend to do their work. And I took my youngest daughter to the circus the other night, which was a great treat. And her, the part that she loved was the circus animals, as lots of kids do. And and we did notice something. We noticed that the trainer had a whip in one hand and a treat in the other, treats. And the trainer, in order to get the animals to do the circus tricks that they wanted the animal to do, would use the whip and the treats to get the animal to oblige. And that is a classic calculation strategy. And heaven forbid if we use that in the workplace, but we tend to, but more in a psychological way of talking about key performance indicators and the advantages of what they might be and the disadvantages of not following the key performance indicators as such. So that becomes a very good illustration of the clear calculator role. So when would you use this? Well, I think that whenever you have got to make a change in your local government environment that'll affect people around you and their working methodologies, their working methods, it requires you to sell and talk up the reason why we're changing, versus what the perils are of not changing. So you need to put a good case so that people get it and they understand why this new computer system is being installed and that what advantages it has over the old system, and the fact that if we don't change, here are some of the consequences that will occur that are negative. So I don't think leaders do enough of this in local government or anywhere for that matter. Where you wouldn't use it is where the direction's not clear. So people that don't have a clear direction about where you're coming from, the first thing you've got to do is to clarify what the direction is. And once you've done that, you can then start using some of the other strategies. But if people don't know or they're confused about what the direction that you're taking might be, well, they're going to basically, they're going to be confused. So they need to have a pros and cons. They need to understand, they're going to need to know what the broad thrust of what you're aiming to do. All right, so that's the calculation strategy. Let's now move on to motivation. And the motivation strategy is one that, and I mentioned Martin Luther King earlier on in the presentation, one of his great speeches is, "I have a dream." And if you ever want to have a look at a wonderfully inspirational speech, go online and have a look at that on YouTube. Tremendous speech. There's not many facts in it because it's all tugging at the heartstrings. It's a very powerful example of using the emotional approach to influence. So motivators will use emotion to influence, and what they do is they tend to link their proposal with the big picture. Now in local government, this is not so difficult to do because all local governments have, by law, a corporate plan, and in that corporate plan is a strategic direction and a set of values. And if you can couch your particular proposal to link with the vision and the values, and so what you're proposing is very consistent with the strategic direction of the organisation, that is going to be influential to certain key people. In other words, it adds another plank of relevance to why you should do what you're doing. This is particularly the case when you're working with elected representatives, of course. People will need to see that. And to a certain extent it's true in the community too, because a new council comes in, they'll have a new strategic direction. And if they can communicate to the community why they're doing something or indeed not doing something, it can be very useful because people can then understand why council has decided to take and adopt a certain course of action. They might not necessarily agree with it, but they certainly might be in a situation where they understand the reasons and rationale for that. Now, if we talk about the mindful motivators, what sort of occupations use this as a strategy? All entrepreneurs are big picture thinkers, and they surround themselves with people who have bought into their particular vision. And, whether it's a Richard Branson or Elon Musk, what they do is they paint a picture of a compelling future, and what it does is it captures the imagination of the followers, and they themselves start to accept and adopt that particular approach. Advertising executives only have a split second to convince us of a course of action, and artistic directors have usually got a big show to put on, and they've got a whole lot of variables and so forth. So if you're working across council, in other words, you're an internal service provider, you might find that you need to be linking what you're proposing with the strategic direction that council has adopted in the corporate plan. So where you would use this, of course, would be where you're developing a new strategic direction, and it requires the hearts and minds of people. So normally when you put together a strategic plan, in council you have to consult the community, you have to consult basically lots of people, and that's actually a good thing, although it's time consuming. And let's face it, not everyone wants to be involved, but by involving people in that, they start to believe in the vision and the direction. But it's a very poor way of influencing people if they're unclear about the rationale of a new initiative. So if council is, for example, adopting cost cutting, and council have directed senior managers to cut costs, but nobody quite understands what that's all about, it's no point in you trying to motivate people. They have to actually have an understanding of why the costs are being cut, where they're going to be cut, and what impact that cut is going to have on the work that that particular person's doing. That's all, of course, investigation, and if that's done, then we might be in a position where we might be able to look at what we can do in relation to those cost cuts and how we can continue to work in our environments. So there's an example of where you wouldn't use it. Okay, so moving right along, the last of the four, and then I'll talk about some very practical things to finish up that you can use. Mother Teresa, who of course has recently been anointed as a saint by the Catholic Church, her great work was in the streets of Calcutta, looking after the poor, the homeless and the sick, and collaborators will have a tendency to influence by working with and through other people to create what the French might call an esprit de corps. So what they're trying to do is to develop a teamwork, harmony across the team. So collaborators will tend to influence people in terms of being able to bring the team together. So it's a tightly knit unit. And of course, Mother Teresa was very powerful and effective at that. She had to bring a whole lot of coalitions of stakeholders together in order to get results on the streets of Calcutta and other places in the world. She had to lobby NGOs and governments for funding, and all of that required collaboration, and so it was a great example. So those of you who had a high score in collaboration probably enjoy working with and through other people, and working on building the team is the critically important part for you. All right, so collaborators, conductors of orchestras don't play a musical instrument, but there it is, it's on your screen. What they do is they will collaborate with the artistic talent in an orchestra to create a beautiful ensemble of music. And so that's what they do. And of course, funeral directors have to deal with all sorts of stakeholders. Those of you in local government who have to deal with stakeholders across the organisation and perhaps external to the organisation probably have learned that collaboration is a critically important component of getting your way in terms of influencing. So in circumstances where there are diverse views in your team, my strong suggestion to you is to get the teams together and get them to articulate their position in a respectful way in a room, and you will find that by doing that you are opening up the possibilities that people may understand a different point of view. So by sweeping it under the carpet or not addressing differences of points of view across teams or within teams, all you're doing is solidifying the view. In other words, people's view becomes stronger. So when people need to know more, such as the logic of putting together a system or approach, there's no good you sitting down with people and asking them how it'll work. They just want information. So, of course, during the amalgamation, which of course seems like a long time ago, probably is really, but we're still feeling the effects of amalgamation, what councils were hungry for the government to give them was information. They wanted the state government to give them some information. So there was no point in collaborating until people understood what the amalgamation was about, how it was going to impact on the local community, which councils would be involved, where the boundaries of the region started and finished, and so forth. All of that information was investigation information. Once they had that, of course, councils could then start to collaborate. All right, so there are the 4 styles and approaches, and as I said before, I'm more than happy to talk to you about doing the electronic version if you'd like to do it, but that's something you'll have to talk to me offline about. So guys, just before we've got about 5 or so minutes, here's a couple of tips and hints that will help you develop those particular influencing capabilities. So those of you who need to exercise your investigation strategy because your score was relatively low compared to the others, use third-party endorsements, use other people who are well respected both in the local community and also within council. Use them as levers to make your proposal. In other words, you can quote them, get them to come to your meetings, put them in your reports, put their, quote them. That's what people do in academic literature. They'll quote people who are significant players in that field. Use structured interviews when you're investigating, because this is what we do in interviews, don't we? When we're interviewing for recruitment and selection, there's a tendency for us to ask the same questions of different people in order to get some validity, so that when we make a decision about somebody and appoint them and give them an offer, what we're doing is we have a very robust system in place, and that adds influence. Doesn't mean we always get it right, of course. Conducting surveys. Surveys are basically influential, not all of them, but many of them are, because they're based on a methodology where we're investigating the views or the topics that people might have that they want to talk about. Process mapping in some of your areas in council. Get a piece of paper out or whiteboard, get your team together and map out the process. What's actually comes first, what comes second, what comes third. Then talk to your team about that process. You will find that's highly effective, because what you're doing is you're involving collaboration and investigation at once. So if you can combine 2 things, you're going to get even better results. Moving on to calculation, which will come up on your screen shortly. Here are 3 things that you can do that can make you more influential in the calculation strategy. A force field analysis. Draw a line down the center of a page, and on the left-hand side you write down all the driving forces for change. And on the right-hand side you write down or list down or bullet point form all the restraining forces for change. And if the driving forces are stronger than the restraining forces, then you have a case for change. All right, so Kurt Lewin's force field analysis is a brilliant way of being able to use calculation as a strategy. Probably the most powerful way is a cost-benefit analysis. If you can explain to people what the costs are of a proposal and also what the benefits are, if the benefits outweigh the costs, then it'll be hugely influential, particularly with elected representatives. They want to see the numbers. And an after-action review is actually looking at results after something's been done in order to make sense of where we might go from there. Looking at motivation, what you might, a couple of things that you might like to do there to build up that. Tell stories. Stories are brilliant. You don't have to be a brilliant orator like Martin Luther King, but what you can do is tell people a story. People respond well to stories. Tell them a true story of what happened to you when you did something and fell flat on your face, as a lesson for them not to do the same thing. And if you can do that, people will actually remember the story rather than you giving them a lecture about what to do or what not to do. Start your meetings with good news stories, and I'll pick up on this in Unit 6. Go round the table and actually ask people to tell you a win for the week. If you have weekly meetings or if you have fortnightly meetings, talk to them about wins for the fortnight. You'll find initially no one will say anything, because people aren't trained to think of positives. They'll think about all the things that went wrong during the month or the fortnight or the week. Well, why not just ask them what went well? It can be very, very useful and creates a very positive upward spiral that can be very useful. For those of you who need to collaborate more, I would suggest to you that you get your teams together, you do some problem solving, you reduce the amount of reporting in your meetings, and you start to actually, your best meetings are 50% discussion and 50% reporting. That's a good token, good rule of thumb. So 50% reporting and 50% collaboration on discussion about issues and how we might tackle certain things in the workplace. You'll find your meetings will be far more enjoyable. You'll find that people will get more out of them, and you'll feel better too as a leader. And of course, we'll pick up all of that in Unit 6 on effective meetings. So folks, that brings us to an end, and you can guess what your homework is. And if you haven't already done it, and I know some of you haven't, you need to complete your profile. I have sent it to you. It's in the link, and if you click on that link, it'll take you to the profile to complete. And if you have done it, or if you haven't done it, you can do the electronic version. You'll have to send me an email. And if you have done it, then my suggestion is that you need to start practicing some of those 16 influencing capabilities in your day-to-day work. That's your homework. So send me an email. I enjoy feedback. I enjoy hearing the stories of struggle or success. By all means, send me that email. And just in finishing, guys, you've got there the program that's in front of you coming up. So next time we meet, we are going to be looking at, we will look at optimizing team performance. So we'll spend a bit of time on that and go through that as such. So thank you for the opportunity of working with you, and I